Hey guys, tonight we ride straight into the dust and grit of the Old West. You're not just sitting in your bed anymore, you're cinching a saddle onto a restless horse while the prairie sun beats down like it's personally offended by your existence. Your boots are coated in fine powder, your throat already dry, and you haven't even started the day's work yet. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least you'll look good in the hat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing who's drifting off from Tokyo, who's nodding off in Toronto, and who's trying to survive a night shift in Tulsa. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You tug at the leather straps, the saddle creaking under your weight as you swing up. The horse shifts, side-eyeing you as if to say, "Really? Another 12 hours of this?" Out on the horizon, the plains stretch endlessly, rolling gold and pale green like an ocean frozen mid-wave. The first thing you notice is the silence. No car horns, no buzzing phones, just the occasional hawk circling above and the low snort of your mount. It's almost peaceful, until you remember that peacefulness here usually means you're about to work yourself half to death. Cowboys weren't just movie icons. Historically, the job was born from Spanish vaqueros, whose horsemanship and cattle driving skills came north into Texas in the 1500s. By the 1800s, their techniques blended with Anglo settlers, native influences, and new terrains. The American cowboy was really a cultural remix, a stitched-together set of skills borrowed, adapted, and battered by time. Historians still argue whether the classic cowboy we picture was more myth than reality. But you don't have much time to ponder. Your boss expects the herd moved, and sunrise waits for no one. You lean forward, reins in hand, boots pressing lightly against the horse's flanks. Dust lifts in a faint golden cloud with every hoof step. The smell is sharp: sweat, leather, sun-baked grass, and the faint tang of manure. Not exactly a lavender candle, but it's the smell of life out here. You adjust your hat, squint against the blinding morning, and let your body sway with the rhythm of the horse. Being a cowboy isn't just about looking rugged in a hat. It's the grind. The early mornings that feel like you never even went to bed. The endless chores, saddling, checking tack, making sure nothing's frayed enough to throw you into the dirt. You have to carry everything with you, from your rope to your tin cup, because there's no convenience store waiting out on the trail. A cowboy's saddle was like a mobile office, with knives, canteens, tobacco, and sometimes even extra boots dangling off it. Imagine strapping your whole life to one backpack, except your backpack occasionally tries to buck you off. And speaking of bucking, you shift in the saddle, thighs already complaining. This isn't the kind of ache you cure with yoga. Your horse moves beneath you, each step a reminder that balance is more survival skill than talent. One wrong shift and you're face first in cactus needles. You try not to think about it, but the cactus looks like it's waiting for the show. Quirky tidbit time. Despite the rugged image, cowboys were surprisingly short on personal hygiene. Bathing was rare, soap even rarer, and changing your shirt might be a once-a-month luxury. Toothbrush. Forget it. You'd be lucky to scrape your teeth with a willow twig. And yet, dime novels painted them as near-mythic figures, handsome, clean, and endlessly gallant. Somewhere between reality and romance lies the cowboy legend we inherit today. The sun climbs higher, and already you feel sweat bead on your neck. You pull your bandana up over your nose, not just to look stylish, but because that dust cloud you're riding into will choke you otherwise. Your throat feels like sandpaper, and your canteen sloshes with what little water you've got. Cowboys often rationed water carefully, sometimes going all day with just a swallow or two. Historians still argue whether the frontier cattle drives were feats of courage or reckless gambles that pushed both men and animals beyond their limits. Standing here, dust in your eyes and lungs, you're leaning toward the latter. Your horse flicks its ears, catching some distant sound. Maybe it's the low bellow of cattle. Maybe it's another rider clanking his spurs. The herd is out there, waiting. You can almost see them in your mind, horns swaying like a restless sea, tails flicking against the swarms of flies that treat cattle like a five-star buffet. It's your job to move them, guard them, keep them from wandering into canyons or stampeding at the first clap of thunder. No pressure, right? The funny thing is, most cowboys weren't even the rugged individualists we picture. They worked in crews, often hired by big ranch owners. Pay was low, maybe $1 a day if you were lucky. That's less than what your morning coffee costs, and you didn't even get oat milk with it. Yet for many the job meant freedom. Freedom from factories, freedom from cities, freedom to ride under a sky so wide it made your problems look like ants. You shift again, your hat brim dripping sweat, your thighs burning, but still you press forward. Every creak of the saddle is a reminder that the day has only just begun. There will be dust storms, rattlesnakes, long nights by smoky fires, but for now, it's you, the horse, and the horizon. Somewhere deep down you realize this is what it takes to be a cowboy. Not gunslinging glory, not a Hollywood smile, but patience, endurance, and the stubborn refusal to quit when the land dares you to. You ride forward into the low thunder of hooves, and the real test of your endurance begins, wrangling the herd. The sound builds gradually, at first a distant tremor beneath the earth, then a rolling percussion that rattles through your chest. When the herd finally comes into view, it's overwhelming. Hundreds of longhorns stretch across the prairie in restless motion, horns like jagged branches stabbing at the sky, tails flicking in irritation at the swarms of flies that hover over their backs. The sight is majestic, sure, but mostly it's terrifying. You're one person on one horse facing what feels like an avalanche of beef. Dust hangs in the air like a living thing, rising in clouds so thick that the horizon disappears. It grinds against your teeth when you grit them, seeps into your eyelids until blinking feels like sandpaper, and settles inside your lungs in a way that makes you wonder if your chest will rattle forever. You pull your bandana up over your nose not to look cool, though you'll take the aesthetic points, but just to breathe. The cattle are never cooperative. They wander when you need them steady, freeze when you need them moving, and stampede toward the one direction that spells disaster. You shout, a deep and oddly musical call that cowhands have passed down for generations, part borrowed from Spanish vaqueros, part improvised growl. It doesn't translate to "please cooperate, dear cows," but it does jar them enough to keep the edges of the herd from drifting too far. You swing your horse wide, chasing down a straggler with horns so wide they could serve as coat racks. The horse anticipates the move, cutting sharply, hooves pounding, while you lean with the motion and try not to think about how easy it would be to tumble face first into a cow pie. Here's a grounding fact for you. In the golden age of cattle drives, roughly from the 1860s through the 1880s, millions of Texas longhorns were driven north to railheads in Kansas. The most famous route, the Chisholm Trail, saw herds sometimes stretching for 2 miles. 2 miles of animals, each weighing over half a ton, each capable of crushing you flatter than a flapjack if you zigged when you should have zagged. Historians still argue whether the cowboy skill made these drives possible, or whether luck and sheer animal stubbornness played the bigger role. Standing here, wiping grit from your stinging eyes, you're leaning toward luck. The smell is overwhelming, a swampy cocktail of manure, sweat, and sun-baked grass. You gag once, then learn to live with it, because you can't wrangle cattle if you're doubled over dry heaving. Your horse twitches its ears at you as if in sympathy, or maybe in complaint. You pat its neck anyway, whispering promises you can't keep. Just a few more hours, buddy. Wrangling isn't about brute strength, it's about reading subtle signals. The flick of a tail, the twitch of an ear, the way one cow angles its head, all hints of what might come next. A sudden ripple through the herd means trouble, panic flowing like electricity. One crack of thunder, one rattlesnake slithering through the grass, and you could have a stampede on your hands. And if you've never imagined the sheer terror of thousands of hooves pounding in one direction, trust me, it makes freeway traffic look like a polite tea party. Quirky tidbit. Cowboys called themselves cowpunchers, a term that sounds like a bad arcade game today, but once meant prodding or urging cattle forward. Sometimes they shortened it to punchers, which might explain why outsiders thought the job was rougher than it often was. The truth? You spend more hours staring at the backsides of cattle than throwing punches, but cowbuck gazer just doesn't have the same ring to it. The hours crawl. The sun climbs high and then higher still until you feel like a loaf of bread left too long in the oven. Sweat trickles down your spine, soaking your shirt until you're wearing a second skin of dust and salt. You holler, whistle, and sometimes just mutter curses, hoping sheer sound will keep the herd together. You circle endlessly, your thighs aching, your knees stiff, your hands blistered from gripping the reins. And still, the herd creeps forward at the pace of molasses on a cold day. Sometimes you find humour where you can. That one steer with a lazy eye. You start calling him Sidewinder, the cow that insists on wandering into thorn bushes. Professor Genius. Giving them names doesn't make the job easier, but it keeps you from losing your mind. You imagine calling roll, here Sidewinder, here Genius, here Old Stinky. If nothing else, it makes the other riders snort with laughter, which is about the only entertainment on this dusty plain. By mid-afternoon, you get the herd into a more open stretch of grass. The animals settle, chewing cud and flicking tails, suddenly calm as if they hadn't just spent the past 6 hours acting like toddlers on a sugar rush. You slump in your saddle, muscles screaming, lips cracked. You gulp from your canteen, and the lukewarm water tastes better than any soda back home. Historical aside. Wages weren't much of a reward for this misery. Cowboys might earn $1 a day, maybe 30 a month, which even in the 1800s wasn't a king's ransom. You risked your neck daily for pay that barely bought boots. Historians still debate whether the cowboy life represented noble freedom or brutal exploitation, but sitting here, coated in sweat and dust, you know it's both at once. And here's your second quirky fact. Cowboys swore by coffee so strong it was said to float a horseshoe. You sip from your tin cup now, the bitter brew scalding your throat, and you can practically feel it etching new grooves in your stomach lining. Without it, you'd collapse. With it, you'll just collapse slightly later. As the sun lowers, shadows stretch long across the plain. The herd finally looks calm, but you know better than to trust appearances. Night will bring new troubles, wolves prowling the edges, rustlers sniffing opportunity, storms rolling in without warning. You straighten in the saddle despite your exhaustion, eyes scanning the horizon. This day's battle is won, but tomorrow waits with teeth bared. For a moment, though, you let yourself exhale. The prairie glows gold, the cattle silhouettes sharp against the crimson sky. Your body aches, your throat burns, and your clothes smell like something that might walk away on its own. But in this fleeting sunset, there's beauty. A wild, stubborn beauty that makes you understand why anyone ever took this job. Night falls on the prairie with startling swiftness. One moment the horizon burns with a molten orange glow, the next it is swallowed by violet shadows, and finally the stars spill across the sky like someone has upended a salt jar on black velvet. You're still in the saddle, still circling the restless herd, and now you begin one of the most peculiar, exhausting duties of the cowboy's life. Night watch. The cattle have been grazing for hours, bellies round with grass, but this doesn't mean they'll stay calm. In fact, nighttime is often when the herd is at its most jittery. Imagine hundreds of prey animals, each equipped with sharp horns and skittish instincts, suddenly plunged into a world of rustling shadows and coyotes howling at the moon. Every flicker of movement, every creak of saddle leather could trigger panic. Your job is to keep them soothed, and to keep them from bolting into the darkness like a furry tidal wave. So you sing, not a grand opera, not a polished ballad, just low, steady tunes, words sometimes improvised, melodies carried from one trail rider to another. Cowboys believed singing calmed the herd, and history backs this up. Cowboy lullabies, they were sometimes called, though they often included nonsense lines, half-remembered hymns, or reworked fiddle tunes. The point wasn't the lyrics, it was the rhythm. Longhorns responded to the steady cadence like infants rocked in a cradle. Some historians even claim certain herds came to recognize individual cowboy voices, settling when their favorite singer was on duty. Your own voice is scratchy, made rougher by dust and coffee, but you hum anyway. Whoa, little doggies. Hush now, don't you roam, you mumble, not caring if the rhyme falls apart. The sound drifts over the cattle, mingling with the occasional snort or the crunch of hooves. Slowly the herd settles, tails swish. If you lie down, horns jutting like twisted sculptures against the moonlight, still you cannot relax. You circle slowly, your horse's hooves muffled in the grass, eyes straining against the dark. You spot the glowing dots of wolf eyes on a far ridge, hear the yipping chorus of coyotes in the distance. Sometimes you wonder whether the singing comforts you more than the cattle, warding off the gnawing loneliness of the night. Another fact, the trail drive's night watch was divided into shifts called watches. Usually 4 riders kept guard at a time, working in rotating shifts of 2 hours. If you drew the middle watch around 2 a.m., you were guaranteed misery, stumbling half asleep into your saddle, body aching, brain fogged. But no matter how tired, you couldn't slack. One moment of inattention could mean disaster, and disasters came often. A rabbit darting through camp could spark a stampede. A sudden clap of thunder could transform calm cattle into a sea of pounding hooves. Stampedes were every cowboy's nightmare. Black chaos, horns flashing, earth trembling. Many died trying to turn the herd, caught under hooves or crushed against riverbanks. Stories passed around campfires told of riders lost without a trace, swallowed into the dark storm of animals. Whether exaggerated or not, the warning was clear: stay sharp. To fight off fatigue, you drink more coffee, though it's lukewarm now, gritty with grounds and tastes like boiled leather. Cowboys swore it kept them alive. In fact, coffee became so essential on the trail that chuck wagon cooks were judged as much by their coffee as by their beans and biscuits. There's a saying recorded from the 1880s. Only thing worse than no coffee is weak coffee. You nod at that truth with every bitter swallow. Your ears prick at every sound. The creak of saddle leather, the chirp of crickets, the steady low murmur of another rider singing somewhere across the herd. You realize the prairie has its own nighttime symphony, stitched together from hooves, insects, and human voices. It is haunting, almost sacred. For a fleeting moment, you imagine the prairie remembering these songs long after the cattle trails have faded, echoes lingering in the grass. Then, a stir. One cow jerks its head, snorting, and a ripple of unease spreads. You tense. Your horse shifts beneath you, catching the energy too. For a moment you fear the dreaded rush of hooves, but then, mercifully, the ripple passes. The herd calms again. Soothed by song and routine, you exhale, realizing your knuckles are white around the reins, and so the hours crawl by. Midnight, 1, 2. Time becomes slippery, measured not in minutes but in how many times you circle the herd. Your body feels both heavy and jittery, caught between exhaustion and adrenaline. Somewhere in the dark you begin talking to your horse, to yourself, to the stars, anything to keep your mind awake. You wonder if other cowboys across miles of prairie are staring at these same constellations, humming the same half-forgotten tunes to their restless cattle. There's a quirky anecdote from a trail diary. One cowboy swore he kept his herd calm by reciting Shakespeare, though his companions insisted it sounded more like gibberish mixed with cussing. Another claimed he whistled lullabies he'd learned from his Irish grandmother. The methods varied, but the goal was the same: keep the cattle calm, keep the riders alive. When the eastern horizon finally begins to pale with the first blush of dawn, you feel relief so deep it's almost dizzying. The herd stirs, rising to their feet, ready to graze again. The night has passed without stampede, without wolves slipping close, without tragedy. You dismount stiffly, legs trembling, and stretch your aching back. The prairie air smells different now, cooler, fresher, filled with dew and the faint promise of morning coffee. You know the day ahead will bring its own hardships, miles of dust, blistering sun, more wrangling. But for now, as dawn streaks the sky pink and gold, you let yourself feel a quiet triumph. You faced the dark, the loneliness, the heavy silence of the prairie, and you endured. The day drains away like water spilling off a tilted bucket, and the prairie shifts from blazing heat to a long stretch of purple dusk. You're bone-tired by the time the herd finally settles, hooves quiet, horns still. Dust clings to your sweat, your shirt feels like sandpaper, and your legs wobble when you dismount. That's when the glow of campfire becomes salvation, your reward for surviving another grinding day on the trail. The cook, called Cookie by everyone, sometimes tyrant in whispers, already has the fire roaring. Sparks snap and swirl upward, swallowed by the dark. He guards his chuck wagon like a banker guards gold, drawers neatly packed with flour, salt, dried beans, and coffee that's strong enough to scald your soul. The chuck wagon is more than a kitchen. It's the moving heart of this strange little family. Everything you need for survival rattles inside. Bandages for cuts, needles for stitching torn shirts, a hatchet, cast iron pans blackened by years of smoke. You shuffle into line, plate in hand. Tonight it's beans, again. Maybe with a slice of salt pork if you're lucky, though you notice most of the fat has already gone to the bottom of the pot. Cookie ladles a thick scoop onto your tin plate, and you sit near the flames, steam rising into your dust-caked face. The beans are tough, chewy, but you shovel them in with gratitude. Hunger is seasoning enough. For dessert, there's sourdough biscuits, baked earlier in a Dutch oven buried in coals. They're so hard you nearly chip a tooth, but at least they soak up the last of your coffee. Trail humour says a cowboy could use leftover biscuits as poker chips, horseshoes, or even bullets if things got desperate. Someone swears Cookie once dropped a biscuit in the fire and the fire went out. Laughter echoes around the flames, low and easy. After a day of sweat and saddle sores, joking about indestructible bread feels like the best entertainment on earth. Entertainment, though, doesn't stop at jokes. Soon, one cowboy pulls a battered harmonica from his pocket, wiping it on his sleeve before coaxing out a wheezing tune. Another claps rhythm on a canteen, while a third adds harmony with a voice rough as gravel. The songs are never polished, never planned, but they rise into the night anyway. Irish ballads bent into cowboy laments, African-American work songs reshaped into trail rhythms, Mexican corridos flowing with tales of brave vaqueros. Cultures collide here at the campfire, and somehow the songs hold them all. Historians argue whether cowboy music deserves to be called America's first folk fusion. But you don't care about labels. You just hum along, soothed by the rhythm. As the music fades, stories bubble up. Cowboys tell tall tales like it's a contest, each trying to outdo the last. One rider insists he once lassoed a cougar, though another quickly points out that if that were true, he wouldn't be alive to tell it. Another describes seeing a dust devil pick up a cow and set it down 200 yards away, unharmed but dizzy. The stories grow taller with each retelling, and nobody interrupts because the laughter is too good. You learn fast. Out here, the campfire is where legends are born. Half memory, half invention, all stitched together with smoke. Sometimes the talk turns serious. Tonight someone mentions land. Not cattle, not biscuits, but the land itself. Who truly owns it? You hear voices rise and fall, some arguing that cattle drives are just progress, others admitting it feels like pushing herds across someone else's backyard. Names of tribes are spoken: Comanche, Kiowa, Apache. Some cowboys tell of peaceful trading, others of raids, others of uneasy glances across rivers. Historians still argue whether the cowboy was a symbol of independence or an agent of encroachment. And here, in the flickering glow of firelight, you can feel both truths pressing uncomfortably together. The fire dies lower. A faint smell reaches you. Smoke. Yes, but something else too. That's when a rider chuckles and explains, fuel isn't always wood. Out here, where trees are scarce, the fire often burns on buffalo chips, dry dung left behind by bison herds. You blink, torn between disgust and admiration. It works surprisingly well. Steady flame, little smoke. Cowboys joke that the prairie provided both dinner and the fire to cook it on. You remind yourself to be grateful, even if the smell makes you wrinkle your nose. Bellies full, the camp stretches out. Bedrolls are unrolled in loose circles around the wagon. No tents, just blankets, tarps if you're lucky, hats pulled low against dew. You drop onto your back, every muscle complaining, and let your eyes drift upward. And there it is, the night sky. Without city lamps or highways, the heavens blaze brighter than you thought possible. The Milky Way pours across the sky like milk spilled on velvet. Stars look close enough to pluck. Constellations sharp as chalk drawings. You trace them lazily with a finger. Orion, the Big Dipper, and one you name yourself. The upside-down boot. Your mind drifts. You remember something odd another cowboy swore by. Sleeping with your boot still on. He claimed it kept rattlesnakes from slithering into them at night. You laugh softly at the absurdity, then realize he might not be wrong. Out here, quirky habits aren't superstition, they're survival tactics. The sounds of the prairie layer over you as you fade towards sleep. Coyotes yip in the distance, answered by another pack across the plain. Your horse shifts nearby, the creak of leather soft in the dark. The fire pops and hisses, its last sparks winking upward like tiny fireflies. A chorus of snores begins, some deep, some wheezy, some punctuated with muttered dreams. The campfire has become a strange, ragged orchestra, equal parts ridiculous and comforting. As your eyelids close, you reflect. Tomorrow will bring more cattle, more dust, more sweat. Your thighs will ache again, your lips will crack, and you'll wish for shade that never comes. But right now, lying under the vast bowl of sky, warmed by a fire that may or may not be fueled by buffalo dung, you feel something steady, a sense of belonging, a rhythm of work, laughter, and song that stretches across miles and years. You smile, drifting off, and think, let the movies romanticize the West with shiny boots and spotless hats. You'll keep your beans, your bad biscuits, your harmonica wheezing under the stars, because this, dust, smoke, laughter and all, is the real heart of cowboy life. The prairie has moods, not gentle ones either. It can wake up smiling, skies so blue they look freshly scrubbed, and by afternoon it's hurling spears of lightning at you as if you personally offended it. Out here, weather is not background. It's an unpredictable boss you never signed up to work for. Today, as you ride with your hat pulled low, you're reminded that survival as a cowboy is just as much about outlasting the skies as it is wrangling stubborn cattle. Morning starts deceptively sweet. The sun rises golden, warm, almost kind. You think you might get a reprieve, a day where the world doesn't try to melt you. But within an hour that kindness curdles. The sun sharpens into a blazing disk that burns straight through your hat brim. Heat rolls up from the ground in shimmers, turning the horizon into a liquid mirage. You squint, eyes watering, lips cracking as you lick away dust that tastes like ash and salt. Your horse swishes his tail in irritation, sweat dampening his neck. You sympathise. Cowboys in the late 1800s wore long-sleeved cotton shirts even in July, not because they liked slow cooking in their own sweat, but because fabric was the only thing standing between skin and blistering sunlight. A hat wasn't optional. It was your personal umbrella, water bucket, and sometimes fly swatter. A cowboy without his hat was like a sailor without his ship, utterly doomed. By noon, the heat feels like it's hollowing you out. You dream of shade, but the prairie is stingy. A lone mesquite tree appears in the distance, so small it could barely shade a jackrabbit, and yet you and the other riders fantasize about it like it's paradise. A tumbleweed skips past, carried by the wind, bouncing freely across the plain. You glare at it, jealous. A rolling ball of weeds has more freedom than you. No cattle, no saddle saws, no trail boss barking orders. Some historians swear tumbleweeds came from Russia in the 1870s, stowing away in flaxseed shipments. Others argue they've always been here, ghosts of the prairie itself. Either way, the tumbleweed has better travel perks than you. Just as you think the sun might be the day's only torment, the air shifts. Clouds gather, dark, low, bruised-looking. The wind stiffens, snapping coats, rattling gear. Horses lift their heads, ears flicking nervously. You feel the hair rise on your arms before the first lightning fork cracks the sky in half. Thunder rolls across the prairie louder than cannons. Then the rain comes. It doesn't tiptoe. It slams down in sheets, stinging like thrown gravel. Your shirt clings instantly, your boots fill with water, and the saddle turns slick under you. The herd panics. Cows bellow, horns clashing, hooves churning mud. You ride hard at the edge, yelling yourself hoarse, trying to keep them from breaking into a stampede. Lightning flashes so bright you see the herd in frozen detail. Wide eyes, frothing mouths, bodies pressing too close. For one terrifying second, you think they'll bolt. Some cowboys swore by singing louder than the thunder. Others banged pots and pans to distract the herd. One diary from 1871 tells of a rider who tried to whistle through a storm, only to be bucked clean off when his horse spooked at his own shrill notes. Cookie, of course, hated storms most of all. If cattle bolted, they often smashed right through his chuck wagon, spilling beans, flour, and precious coffee across the mud. No cowboy wanted to face him afterward. Between stampeding cattle and an angry Cookie, most riders considered the cattle the lesser threat. And then, like a tantrum burned out, the storm passes. Clouds tear open, leaving strips of blue, and the prairie glistens with puddles. The air smells sharp, electric, alive. Steam rises off cattle hides. Your teeth chatter inside wet clothes, but you sit straighter, relieved. You survived another tantrum, and for a reward the sunset paints the sky with streaks of crimson and violet, the kind of beauty no painter could match. Night falls, and the prairie reveals its second cruelty. Cold. The same land that roasted you at noon now gnaws your bones with icy wind. You curl in your bedroll, shivering, hat pulled over your face. Cowboys sometimes froze boots solid overnight, waking to find them stiff as iron. Some solved it by sleeping with boots still on, uncomfortable but practical. Others wrapped themselves in wet blankets, let them freeze stiff, and used the ice as armour against the wind. Historians still argue whether that story was truth or bravado, but either way it proves desperation makes inventors of everyone. On other nights, instead of cold, you face dust storms. The air thickens, wind hurls grit until the sky disappears in a brown haze. You cough, spit mud, cover your mouth with a bandana, eyes burning like peppers been thrown in them. Cowboys called it dust pneumonia, when the grit settled too deep in lungs. Nothing romantic about hacking all night, but still, you ride. Because stopping means losing cattle. You remind yourself that the West wasn't built on glamour. It was built on grit, literally in your teeth. The longer you endure, the more you understand why cowboys were mythologized as tough. It wasn't swagger or revolvers. It was surviving the sky's moods. Sun, storm, cold, dust. The prairie tested you in ways no outlaw duel ever could. Historians still argue whether toughness was exaggerated for dime novels, but when you're soaked, shivering, and spitting dust, you know the stories had at least some truth. Finally a star breaks free in the clearing sky. Then another. The herd, weary from weather's torment, lowers heads to graze in wet grass. Horses snort, steam rising. You pull your blanket tighter, teeth still rattling, but you smile anyway. You've been baked, drowned, frozen, and half choked, and somehow you're still here. That counts as victory. Your horse is not a tool, not really. You learn that quick, usually the hard way. At first you think he's just transport, a four-legged wagon hauling you across endless grass. But the longer you ride, the more you realise this animal is your partner, sometimes your only ally when the prairie or cattle turn mean. Without him, you're just a sore-footed human trying to keep up with animals that can run for miles. With him, you're something else entirely. A cowboy. This morning before dawn you shuffle out from your bedroll to check on your horse. His breath puffs white in the cool air. His ears flick as he notices you coming, head low, a little wary. Horses don't automatically trust. You earn that in long, slow installments. Patience, brushing, feeding, not yanking the reins when he startles. Cowboys used to say you could measure a man by how he treated his horse. Rough hands made for a short partnership, kind hands built loyalty. Your mount isn't a sleek racing animal like some European noble would show off in paintings. He's compact, tough, sturdy. Many were descended from Spanish mustangs that had gone wild for centuries, lean survivors of desert and canyon. Cowboys valued endurance over elegance. A horse that could go 3 days without faltering meant more than one that looked pretty trotting in a parade. Some trail bosses even nicknamed the best mounts after saints or devils depending on their temper. Yours is somewhere in between, an angel when fed and a demon when hungry. Saddling up is a ritual. You check the cinch twice because one careless strap could mean you sailing into the dirt when the herd spooks. The saddle creaks, smelling of sweat and oil. You slide a hand along your horse's neck, muttering nonsense words to calm him, though you're not sure if he listens. Horses sense mood more than meaning. If you're jittery, he'll be jittery too. If you're steady, he might actually follow your lead instead of bolting after the nearest distraction. A jackrabbit, a shadow, or a sudden clap of thunder. There's an old cowboy saying, "A horse is smarter than a man because he won't work for free." You feel that truth every time you try to coax your mount through a swollen river or past a patch of cactus he knows will shred your legs. He resists, plants his hooves, rolls his eyes at you in what looks suspiciously like sarcasm. Historians still argue whether cowboys really loved their horses or just tolerated them as tools. But when you've ridden 50 miles together and that animal keeps you from breaking your neck in a gopher hole, it's hard not to feel respect. By midday, you and your horse move like a single body, weaving around the herd. The cattle shift, restless in the heat, but your horse doesn't shy. He cuts left when you lean left, right when you press a knee. You don't think, you just respond to each other. This is the bond trail bosses counted on, the quiet, wordless teamwork between rider and mount. Some old-timers swore you could drop the reins entirely and just guide with your legs, and the horse would know the herd's rhythm better than you. There are funny moments too. Horses have quirks. One ranch diary tells of a horse that would stop dead if he spotted a snake, even a tiny garden one. Another had a habit of sneaking bites of the chuck wagon bread if left tied too close. You've seen yours try to roll in the dirt mid-ride, almost crushing your leg under him, as if to say, "I've carried you long enough, buddy. It's my turn to relax." You curse, swat his flank, but secretly admire the nerve. At dusk the bond deepens, the herd calms, shadows stretch long, and you find yourself stroking your horse's mane, whispering gratitude he'll never understand in words but maybe senses in tone. Out here, you don't have close friends most nights. You have cattle that ignore you, coyotes that laugh in the dark, and maybe a fellow cowboy who snores so loud he could rattle fence posts. But your horse listens in his own way. He lowers his head, lets you lean against him, warm and solid, like leaning against a piece of earth that moves. Not every story ends well. A misstep can lame a horse, and then you're stuck. Cowboys dreaded that more than a broken rifle. Horses meant livelihood. Without them, you couldn't move cattle, couldn't chase strays, couldn't even keep pace with the wagon. Some men buried their mounts with quiet ceremony, muttering prayers, though others traded sentiment for speed. Ride one till it dropped, then catch another. Historians still argue how widespread that callousness was, but frontier life rarely allowed luxury of mourning. Tonight, as the stars prick the sky and the coyotes tune up their nightly chorus, you rub down your horse with a rag. He leans into it, eyes half-lidded, as if saying, "Fine, you're not completely useless." You grin, scratch behind his ears, and settle into your blanket nearby. His steady breathing will be the closest thing to a lullaby you get. And tomorrow, when the trail stretches endless again, you'll swing into the saddle and he'll carry you forward without complaint. Or maybe with just enough complaint to remind you this is a partnership, not ownership. Because out here, to be a cowboy isn't just about wearing spurs or roping cattle. It's about knowing that when the world turns rough, the only heartbeat you can depend on besides your own might just belong to a horse. The chuck wagon is already smoking before dawn. Sparks leap from the fire pit. Smoke curls low across the grass, and somewhere inside the haze, Cookie is cursing at his pans. You rub your eyes, crawl from your blanket, and the smell hits. Burnt coffee, beans simmering, bacon grease hissing. It's equal parts comfort and threat. Comfort, because hot food is the only mercy waiting after a night of shivering on hard ground. Threat, because if you say one wrong word about the taste, Cookie might bury you in the flour sack and call it justice. The chuck wagon is more than a kitchen. It's the lifeline of the drive. Charles Goodnight, yes, the same rancher who carved trails across Texas, built the first official chuck wagon in 1866, converting an army surplus wagon into a rolling pantry. Cowboys everywhere copied it because it solved the impossible. How do you feed 24 hungry riders for months without going mad? The answer sat on 4 creaking wheels, pulled by mules, rattling with iron pots and coffee tins. Without it, there is no drive, no morale, no cowboys at all, just starving men too weak to stay in the saddle. Step closer, and you see its anatomy. The rear folds down into a work table, the chuck box, stacked with drawers, each labelled in Cookie's handwriting, flour, beans, coffee, sugar. The lids squeak when opened, puffing dust into the air. Leather straps keep pans from clattering loose. A water barrel sloshes on the side. Every nail, every rope, every ladle has its place, because if one thing goes missing in the middle of the prairie, you're in trouble. Cowboys didn't admire order in much else, but they respected the sacred arrangement of the chuck wagon. Mess with Cookie's system, and you risk starvation, or worse, his temper. Meals were, let's say, consistent. Breakfast, beans, biscuits, maybe salt pork if you're blessed. Dinner, beans again, maybe stewed beef if a longhorn collapsed from exhaustion. Supper, guess what? Beans, biscuits, maybe dried fruit if Cookie's in a generous mood. Cowboys joked that beans weren't just food. They were music. A trail camp after supper sounded like a brass band of trumpets tuning up. You laugh quietly, but then groan as your stomach rumbles in ominous agreement. Historians still argue whether the all beans all the time diet is exaggerated, but the joke survived for a reason. Coffee was non-negotiable. Cowboys boiled it black, strong enough to strip paint. The pot never left the fire. If you were desperate, you chewed coffee grounds straight. Some riders swore by adding crushed eggshells to settle the bitterness. Others insisted Cookie secretly reused the same grounds 3 times. No matter the trick, the result was liquid courage in a tin cup, scalding your tongue, keeping you awake on night guard. Cowboys said you could judge an outfit by its coffee. Bad coffee, bad morale, good coffee, you could endure anything. Then there was sourdough, Cookie's pride. He kept a starter alive in a crock jar, feeding it like a pet, yelling at anyone who jostled it. Out of it came biscuits, tangy and golden, baked in a Dutch oven buried under coals. On lucky nights, he'd whip up flapjacks or cobbler. You watch cowboys fight over the last biscuit, crumbs flying like gold dust. In a world of monotony, sourdough was heaven. Cookie himself, well, he was legend. Always older, often crankier, sometimes half lame from old injuries. He barked orders, swung ladles like clubs, and swore with such creativity you couldn't help but laugh. Cowboys feared him more than the trail boss, because the boss might dock your pay, but Cookie could ruin your supper. Tales abound. One Cookie who tossed a snake into stew to prove meat is meat. Another who threw a cowboy's plate into the fire for daring to ask for seconds. Scholars still argue whether these were facts or campfire exaggerations, but one thing's sure, nobody disrespected the cook. The chuck wagon wasn't just for food. It carried medicine, salves, whiskey, bandages. It was also supply closet, post office, and complaint department. If you tore a shirt, Cookie might patch it. If you got bucked off your horse, Cookie wrapped your ribs. If you whined too much, Cookie threatened to feed you soap. Cowboys half joked he was cook, doctor, preacher, and judge, all rolled into one. Evenings around the chuck wagon were the closest thing to home. After driving cattle all day, you sat near the fire, balancing tin plates, boots steaming in the heat. The herd muttered in the dark, coyotes howled at the horizon, and Cookie ladled stew with mechanical precision. Someone strummed a guitar, someone else hummed a hymn, and for an hour the roughness softened. Faces glowed orange in the firelight. Laughter mingled with the pop of beans boiling, and you felt, just for a moment, that maybe this wasn't misery but some kind of adventure. Morning shattered that illusion. Before dawn, Cookie banged pots like war drums, yelling, "Come and get it!" You staggered from your bedroll, rubbing eyes, bones aching. Breakfast was hot but rushed. More beans, maybe bacon, crisp to the point of leather, biscuits reheated from last night. You chewed fast, gulped coffee, and mounted up while Cookie packed the wagon. By sunrise, you were already miles down the trail, fueled mostly by caffeine and stubbornness. It hits you then. All the cowboy grit, all the rugged romance people paint. It runs on beans, biscuits, bacon grease, and coffee. Without the chuck wagon, no trail would last a week. Without Cookie, you'd collapse before Kansas. The cowboy myth loves lone riders silhouetted at sunset. But the truth is, behind every cowboy stands a cranky, flour-dusted cook keeping him alive. Tonight you scrape the last of your stew, lick the spoon and sigh. The prairie is cold, your boots ache, and your body feels stitched together with exhaustion. But with the chuck wagon fire crackling nearby, you realize you'll make it through one more day. Not gracefully, maybe, but you'll make it. And that's the secret truth. Out here, the West was conquered not just with spurs and ropes, but with cookies, beans, and biscuits. When the day finally collapses into night, the prairie seems to take a long exhale. The sun leaves the horizon in a smear of red and orange. Shadows stretch until they fuse into a single dark plain, and the steady bawling of cattle softens into a low murmur. You feel it in your shoulders, in the calluses of your hands, in the grit between your teeth. The weight of the trail lifting, if only a little. You swing down from the saddle, legs stiff as fence posts, boots hitting the packed earth with a dull thud. Every step creaks like an old barn door, but you follow the others toward the one comfort waiting at day's end, the fire. The cook fire is no gentle candle flame. It snaps and spits, sparks scattering like tiny meteors before vanishing into the dark. Cookie, who doubles as chef, medic, and resident philosopher, already stands guard with his long spoon like a weapon. He barks at anyone who dares wander too close, swatting the air as if his stew could be spoiled by breathing wrong. Still, the smell of beans bubbling in the iron pot, the aroma of scorched coffee strong enough to wake the dead, pulls everyone in. You drop down near the circle, hat tipped back, the heat of the fire kissing your dirt-crusted face. Conversation starts in scattered bursts. bouncing between tired men like stones skipped on water. Someone jokes about your clumsy rope work earlier. Another teases a partner for singing off-key on herd watch, and the circle erupts in laughter. It isn't elegant, but it's medicine. Humour works like liniment on sore muscles, dulling the sting of exhaustion. Once the laughter dies down, the tall tales begin. A cowboy swears he saw a jackrabbit so big it could carry off a saddlebag. Another claims he fought off 3 bandits with nothing but a frying pan. Nobody believes them, but nobody wants the stories to stop either. The prairie is too empty to silence them. Then comes music, thin but persistent. A harmonica sighs out a tune, bending notes to match the moan of the wind. Someone hums, someone else joins, until voices layer together like overlapping blankets. The cattle seem calmer when the singing starts, and many a cowboy insists the music lulls the herd into steady rest. Historians still argue whether the songs really mattered, or whether the steers just grew tired after miles of walking. But when you're here, it feels like proof enough. The songs themselves are patchworks of memory, Irish ballads carried by immigrants, Mexican corridos learned from vaqueros, half-forgotten hymns from dusty churches. Out here, they fuse into something new, something that belongs to the night. The fire loosens tongues in other ways too. Cowboys talk of farms left behind, of mothers who still send letters that might never catch up, of sweethearts whose patience may have already worn thin. Some men stay quiet, staring into the coals like they're divining answers from the glow. The prairie listens, its silence broken only by the low hum of insects and the occasional yip of coyotes. You can almost feel the land absorbing secrets, storing them in its endless folds. Traditions weave themselves into these hours. Tin cans tossed into flames pop like fireworks, a crude form of entertainment. Knives carve initials into wagon planks, rough signatures that outlast the men who made them. And of course, ghost stories ripple through the group. Tales of phantom herds stampeding across the heavens, or the ghost rider who roams the plains without a head, lantern swinging from his saddle. Skeptics scoff. But when the fire dies low and shadows deepen, even you find yourself glancing over your shoulder. Out here, under a sky so wide it feels alive, who can say what's real? Danger doesn't end with sunset. Coyotes may steal scraps, rattlesnakes curl unseen in bedrolls, and the cattle themselves can spell disaster. A spooked herd at night means stampede, a thunder of hooves that could crush anything in its path. Old-timers tell of a snoring cowboy whose rumble set off 100 head of cattle. Probably a tall tale, but the lesson lingers. Saddles stay close, rifles propped where hands can find them in a blink. Sleep comes in fragments, broken by watch duty, because someone must always guard against panic in the herd. And then there is the sky. You tilt back your head and the stars sprawl so wide and sharp they steal your breath. No city smoke, no lantern glow, just an ocean of glitter overhead. The Milky Way cuts its bright stripe clear across the heavens, and you realise how small you are in this wide, relentless world. Some nights, cowboys swear they can navigate just by watching the stars shift. Others just stare, humbled by the immensity. One cowboy mutters, "That sky don't end," and nobody bothers to argue. Slowly, the camp winds down. Cookie packs his pots with muttered curses. Bedrolls unfurl with practised flicks. Hats tip low over eyes. The fire sinks into embers, glowing like the heart of some buried beast. Sleep comes unevenly, the air alive with the drone of insects, the shifting of horses, the lowing of cattle. Yet, despite the ache in your body, the fear of stampedes, and the ghosts whispered into the dark, there is comfort here. You're held in the fragile circle of firelight, bound by laughter, song, and story. Tomorrow will be merciless again, but tonight you let the warmth and voices carry you into uneasy dreams. Law on the frontier is never neat, never clean, and almost never what you imagine from polite books back east. It doesn't wear polished uniforms or arrive with orderly courtrooms. Out here, law rides in on a tired horse, with a battered hat, a badge pinned crooked to a dusty vest, and a revolver that may or may not work when the chips are down. You think freedom stretches endless under the big sky, but the second you ride into a cow town after weeks of open prairie, you feel another truth, the weight of law, or at least the performance of it. Picture yourself rolling into Dodge City, Abilene, or some two-street outpost built around a saloon and a feed store. You and the herd hands look like scarecrows that stumbled out of a dust storm, faces cracked from sun, shirts stiff with sweat, boots caked in manure. You've earned a drink, maybe 2, maybe 3. But leaning against the boardwalk is a deputy, arms folded, eyes narrowed. He doesn't care about your trail miles. He cares about whether you'll throw a punch in his saloon. His badge glints in the lamplight, but it glints no brighter than the 6-shooter at his side. You suddenly remember, the range may belong to cowboys, but the towns belong to the law, or at least to the men pretending to be it. The irony. Lawmen and outlaws were often cut from the same cloth. Historians still argue whether Wyatt Earp was a fearless peacekeeper or a gambler with a badge. Was Wild Bill Hickok a noble marshal or a gunslinger who liked the sound of his own legend? Nobody agrees, not then and not now. A sheriff might calm a brawl in the morning, take bribes by noon, and join a poker table by nightfall. Justice on the frontier often meant whatever suited the moment. It wasn't fairness that kept the peace. It was reputation, leverage, and sometimes just dumb luck. You've heard the stories round the campfire, half truth, half smoke. Jesse James riding hard after a train robbery, Billy the Kid grinning while dodging bullets, Belle Starr strutting into a saloon with more confidence than any ranch foreman you've ever met. Outlaws became campfire saints in their own way. Sure, most cowboys knew better than to actually live that life. Short, brutal, always one step ahead of a rope. But still, a part of you wonders, what would it feel like to ride with no boss, no herd, no dawn to dusk grind? To live by your own rules, even if they kill you young? That itch never quite goes away. And yet, outlaw life is not so distant from cowboy life. On the trail you live by codes too, though they're unwritten. You don't steal another man's horse, not unless you want to be thrown out, maybe worse. You don't shirk on night watch, because lives depend on it. You don't lose cattle through laziness, because the crew won't forgive it. A cowboy crew becomes its own court. Arguments break out, fists fly, knives flash, but once settled, the slate is wiped clean. Grudges don't survive when tomorrow's stampede might demand the same man's strong arm to save your skin. Practicality keeps the peace more often than laws on paper. Still, frontier justice could turn ugly. You've seen it yourself. Hand-painted warnings nailed to posts. Thieves will be shot. Rustlers will hang. Vigilance committees forming in the dead of night, dragging suspects from beds, stringing them up before dawn. Trials are rare, evidence often thinner than the rope. Historians debate whether such swift punishments kept chaos at bay or poisoned the very soil of the West. To you, it's simpler. When you ride past a cottonwood and see a noose swaying in the morning wind, you remember that law out here isn't blind. It's brutal and personal, and it doesn't wait for proof. The town saloon is often where law and outlaw collide in full view. You step through swinging doors and the place is alive with noise. Glasses clinking, dice rattling, boots pounding out impatience. A sheriff might be hunched at one end, pretending to play cards but really keeping eyes on everyone. An outlaw, or just a reckless cowboy, might swagger through the middle, spurs jangling, daring anyone to call him out. One wrong word, one spilled drink, and pistols flash. Sometimes the lawman draws first, sometimes the outlaw does, sometimes neither survives. Later, dime novels will polish these duels into clean showdowns, but here they're messy, sudden, and usually end with a lot of shouting and someone's boots pointing skyward. Around the campfire, stories blur until sheriffs and outlaws become almost interchangeable. The badge is dented, the holster frayed, the boots muddy whether you're chasing bandits or leading them. Hollywood will later pretend that good guys wear white hats and bad guys wear black, but you laugh at that. Out here, hats are just whatever colour the dust stains them. Some of the so-called peacekeepers are as ruthless as the thieves, and some outlaws show strange streaks of honour. The line isn't thin, it's constantly shifting. Yet you still tip your hat to the few who try, against all odds, to keep order. Imagine walking alone into a saloon thick with whiskey fumes, fists flying, chairs breaking, knives flashing. A deputy has to talk steady, keep his hand near iron, ready to draw or not draw in a heartbeat. That takes courage of its own kind, maybe even more than chasing cattle through a storm. Foolish? Maybe. Noble? Sometimes. Necessary? Always. Because without that fragile attempt at order, the West might have devoured itself whole. So you move through this world careful and alert. You keep your laugh easy, your words short, your hand steady near your belt. You learn to read eyes, not badges, because law is not about the badge. It's about the man who wears it, and whether today he feels like justice or just another outlaw. Out here, law is written in dust, in bullet scars etched deep into saloon doors, in rope fibres stretched taut under the weight of another story gone wrong. You ride knowing that tomorrow you might shake hands with a lawman in the morning and watch him ride with outlaws at dusk. And maybe that's the real truth of the Cowboys' West. Not the clear battles between good and evil, but the constant balancing act of surviving in the grey. You might imagine the West as a stage for men only, dusty trails full of spurs, guns and cattle. But the truth is more complicated. Women were there, riding the same trails, shaping the same towns, and often doing twice the work for half the recognition. If cowboys were the muscle of the frontier, women were its backbone, bending under endless weight but never quite breaking. Without them, the West would not have stood upright at all. Picture a homestead, lonely on the open plain. Wind never stops howling, rattling loose boards, sneaking under door cracks, carrying grit into food, blankets, even your teeth. A cowboy might ride past, tip his hat and vanish, but the woman in that house cannot ride away. She stays, seasons upon seasons, with children clinging to her skirts and fields demanding her sweat. She plants corn in soil that barely yields, hauls water from a well so deep the rope burns her palms, chops wood, tends fires, nurses the sick, and still finds the strength to patch shirts worn thin from labour. If the cowboy's life is about motion, hers is about endurance, endless, grinding and vital. But not all women lived tethered to cabins. Some rode the trail, hats pulled low, pistols on hips, daring anyone to say they didn't belong. You hear the names whispered in bunkhouses, Calamity Jane, who could shoot straighter than most men and drink them all under the table. Annie Oakley, small as a sparrow, yet her rifle cracked with the precision of thunder, shattering every notion that the frontier was a man's domain. These women carved their place by force of will, refusing to be erased. They remind you that grit is not measured in size or gender, but in the steady refusal to yield. Even in towns, women wielded power, though often in shadows. Saloons, boarding houses and dance halls ran on their labour. Some worked as entertainers, drawing cowboys in with laughter and song, keeping coin flowing across card tables. Others managed inns or stores, their ledgers as sharp as their tongues. They were the quiet mathematicians of survival, making every penny stretch in places where a single missed payment could mean ruin. And then there were the so-called soiled doves, women who traded respectability for survival, navigating a world that judged them while leaning heavily on the money they brought. History remembers them with scorn, but the truth is plainer. They kept towns alive when cattlemen's paydays rolled through. Still, perhaps the most striking stories are those of women who defended their homes with the same fierceness as any gunslinger. You've heard tales. A widow who held off rustlers with a shotgun until dawn, children crouched behind her skirts, a ranch wife who rode 20 miles through storm and darkness to fetch a doctor for her fevered baby. The frontier demanded steel, and women answered with steel of their own. Outlaws might laugh at a badge, but few laughed at a mother aiming steady across a cabin window. You notice, too, how women altered the rhythm of cowboy life. After weeks of riding dusty miles, a letter from home, written in careful, slanted ink, could steady a drifting man's spirit. A ribbon tucked into a pocket, a photograph smudged from too much handling, became anchors in the endless churn of cattle drives. Cowboys swaggered in saloons, but many fell silent when a letter arrived, reading each word like scripture. Women gave the cowboy's wandering heart a tether, even if only a thin thread stretched across states. And then there were the women who crossed into the cowboy's world outright. Some dressed in trousers and boots, riding alongside men, lariats spinning, herding cattle under the same blistering sun. They often had to prove themselves twice over, once as riders, once as women daring to ride at all. But prove themselves they did, and their presence unsettled the neat picture of the West as a man's playground. Those who rode beside them quickly learned. The herd doesn't care about gender. Cattle stampede just as hard, rivers drown just as quick, storms drench all alike. The work itself is the only equalizer. Think of the quiet revolutions women carried in their hands. A teacher stepping off the stagecoach, books in her satchel, determined to bring letters and numbers to children who had only known dust and cattle bells. A nurse tending wounded men in a town where doctors came late or not at all. A suffragist pinning notices to a church door, demanding that women's voices matter in decisions shaping these raw communities. These women did not just live in the West, they reshaped it, line by line, choice by choice. And yet, their sacrifices often vanish in cowboy songs. Ballads glorify stampedes and six-shooters, but rarely sing of the woman burying a child in hard ground, of the girl carrying buckets across miles, of the grandmother stitching quilts by lamplight so families could keep warm through brutal winters. But their work stitched together the frontier itself, invisible threads holding a fragile society from unravelling. Without them, the West would be nothing more than drifting herds and lonely graves. So, as you ride on, you begin to see women not as figures on the edges, but as the heartbeat running beneath every mile. They are the reason cabins stand, fields yield, schools rise, towns endure. Their resilience disguised as ordinary, iron wrapped in calico, legends who rarely made it into storybooks but whose fingerprints remain on every weathered board and every patch of tamed land. You, a cowboy with dust on your boots, cannot help but nod in respect. For all your freedom, it is their endurance that built a world worth riding through. You've seen the movies, right? Cowboys ride into town with spotless white hats, glinting spurs, and horses that never stumble. They shoot faster than lightning, charm every saloon girl with a wink, and always, somehow, ride off into a glowing sunset. If that's your picture of cowboy life, brace yourself. It's more smoke than saddle. The myths of the cowboy world might sparkle on a movie screen, but when you're actually living it, you find mud up to your knees, coffee that tastes like burnt shoe leather, and a horse with a mind of its own. Take the hat, for instance. Hollywood always makes it pristine, like someone polishes it every morning. In reality, your hat is both umbrella and bucket, shielding you from rain, scooping water for your horse, swatting flies, maybe even hiding your face when you sneak a nap. It smells like sweat, smoke, and sometimes cow dung, and it's battered enough to make a city slicker think you wrestled a bear. No one cares if it's pretty. It just has to survive the weather and stay on your head when the wind howls across the plains. And the gunfights, don't get carried away. Historians still argue whether quick-draw duels even happened the way dime novels describe. Yes, gunfights occurred, but they were messy, terrifying, and usually short-lived. Most cowboys didn't walk around slinging iron for the fun of it. Ammunition cost money, and real life had no dramatic soundtrack. If a cowboy fired his gun, it was more likely to scare off rustlers, protect cattle from predators, or blast snakes slithering too close to camp. But who would pay a dime to read about that? Then there's the myth of the cowboy as a lone wolf, wandering free and untamed. The truth? Cowboys worked in teams. Herding cattle required cooperation. Riders spread out to guide the herd, night guards keeping watch in shifts, cooks hauling the chuck wagon with enough beans to feed a small army. You couldn't just decide to be the mysterious loner and ditch the crew. That would mean no pay, no food, and probably no survival. The West punished arrogance quickly. Another myth you probably absorbed is the idea that cowboys were exclusively American-born white men. But the real story is more colourful. A large portion were Mexican vaqueros, the original inventors of much of cowboy gear and technique. Others were African-American freedmen seeking wages after the Civil War, or native riders blending their traditions with ranch work. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany and beyond found their way onto saddles chasing opportunity. The frontier wasn't a monochrome movie poster. It was a patchwork quilt of cultures, stitched together with leather reins and calloused hands. Speaking of leather, let's clear up another bit of nonsense. Those shiny, squeaky boots you see on screen. In real life, boots were tools, not fashion. Pointed toes slipped easily into stirrups, heels kept you steady in the saddle, and high shafts protected legs from brush, snakes, and, you guessed it, cow dung. They were meant to be dirty, scuffed, and sometimes patched with whatever scraps were handy. No one cared if they gleamed in the sun, unless you were trying to impress a greenhorn. Cowboys in film also spend a lot of time in saloons, drinking whiskey by the gallon, gambling until dawn, and breaking chairs over each other's heads. The reality was far less glamorous. Whiskey was usually harsh rot gut that burned like liquid fire, and most cowboys couldn't afford to throw away wages on poker every night. A big payday might mean a spree in town, but the rest of the time, saloons offered cheap meals, bad coffee, and a corner to rest boots. And about those bar brawls? If chairs were broken every night, someone had to fix them, and carpenters weren't cheap. Even the cattle drives themselves get mythologized. Hollywood makes them seem like non-stop excitement, stampedes every hour, coyotes howling dramatically, heroic rides across endless golden plains. In truth, the drives were monotonous. Days blended together, with hours of plodding behind a slow-moving herd, dust choking your throat, and sun bleaching everything the same dull colour. The real enemy wasn't bandits or wild shootouts, but boredom, fatigue, and the grind of doing the same thing day after day. Yet it's precisely that grind that built the Cowboys' reputation for toughness. Quirky fact for you. One of the most enduring cowboy myths actually started as marketing. Rodeos in the late 19th century needed to draw crowds, so they leaned into the wild gunfighter and noble cowboy imagery, packaging grit into a spectacle. Soon dime novels and later movies doubled down on the fantasy, selling millions of copies and tickets. Cowboys who were once anonymous labourers became larger-than-life icons, though many of the real men would have laughed at the exaggerations, or rolled their eyes while shoveling manure. Yet myths aren't useless. They give the cowboy his mythic glow, the reason kids still play cowboys and Indians, the reason boots and hats remain fashion statements. They also carry something true at their core: courage, resilience, and the pull of open space. Historians still argue whether the myths distort more than they inspire, but one thing's clear: the cowboy legend has legs longer than a trail ride. So you sit by the campfire, dust on your face, watching sparks rise into a velvet sky. You know better than anyone that the myths are polished and false, but you also understand why people cling to them. After all, reality is sweat, dirt, and sore bones. Myths? They let people dream. And sometimes, in the middle of endless cattle and cold nights, a dream is worth holding on to. The fire crackles, and you feel the weight of the day slide off your shoulders. Out here on the open range, there isn't much to distract you once the sun dips below the horizon. No glowing screens, no traffic noise, no endless scroll of news. Just the night sky stretching wide and the sound of cattle shifting restlessly in the distance. And that's where songs and stories come in. They're not luxuries, they're survival tools. When you spend weeks riding dusty miles, your voice becomes the entertainment system, your memory the library, and the flickering firelight the only spotlight you'll ever need. You start humming. At first it's just to yourself, a low tune that blends with the whisper of wind and the shuffle of hooves. Before long, another rider picks it up, then another, until a ragged chorus weaves across the camp. Cowboy songs are simple, but they cut deep. They talk about lost love, endless trails, and sometimes beans so bad they'd make a mule cry. One of the most famous, Home on the Range, still drifts into modern ears, though it was once just another campfire ballad sung to keep men awake during long shifts. Historians still argue whether some verses were first sung by cowboys or borrowed from earlier folk tunes, but no matter. The words stuck because they carried comfort across the lonely plains. There's a practical side to these songs too. You might not guess it, but cattle are nervous creatures. A sudden noise, a shadow, even a sneeze in the wrong moment can send hundreds of them stampeding into chaos. Cowboys learned early that singing calmed the herd. A steady voice reassured the animals that everything was fine. Imagine it, you riding slowly under the stars, your horse swaying beneath you, your voice echoing soft and steady, keeping the herd from bolting into the dark. You're not crooning for applause, you're singing so your paycheck doesn't scatter into the night. Quirky fact, some cowboys swore cattle preferred off-key singing. Maybe they liked imperfection, maybe it was the low rumble, but either way, even the worst singers had a job. And when songs wound down, stories took over, You sit closer to the fire, sparks snapping upward, and listen as the oldest hand starts spinning a tale. Sometimes it's about a legendary outlaw, other times about a haunted canyon where lost riders wander forever. A cowboy story might stretch truth thinner than old leather, but that was the point. After all, who wants plain facts when a sprinkle of imagination can keep you awake and laughing? One moment you're hearing about rustlers who vanished into thin air, the next about a cow that supposedly outran a train. Did it happen? Probably not. Does it matter? Not at all. Every crew had its storytellers, the ones who turned silence into theatre. You find yourself leaning in, laughter bubbling up when someone adds a sarcastic twist or a silly impersonation. Out here, humour is as valuable as water. Without it, the monotony might crush you. A joke about a mule refusing to move, a prank involving a misplaced saddle, even a story about beans cooked so hard they chipped teeth. These kept men sane. Cowboys weren't just herders of cattle. They were curators of oral tradition, passing along tall tales like precious heirlooms. But stories weren't only for laughs. They carried warnings. You'd hear about stampedes that crushed riders, rivers that swallowed wagons, or storms that scattered herds beyond recovery. Wrapped in humour and exaggeration, these tales held kernels of truth. They were the cowboy's handbook, passed from mouth to ear, teaching greenhorns what books never could. One night's laughter might save your life on a dark trail. Historians still debate how much of cowboy lore was invention versus memory, but either way, it built a culture stronger than barbed wire. Sometimes songs and stories stretched beyond the campfire. In towns, they became performances. Fiddlers tuned strings in saloons, and poets scribbled verses that later grew into country western traditions. Even the roughest riders had moments when music softened them, making them dream of home, of women waiting somewhere, or of a world where dust didn't cling to every pore. You realize that without these small escapes, the cowboy life might be unbearable. Singing into the night wasn't frivolous, it was medicine for the soul. You laugh, remembering one rider who couldn't carry a tune to save his hide. Every time he opened his mouth, the herd stirred nervously as if plotting an escape. Finally, the cook begged him to stop before they all lost their jobs. But when that same rider told stories, everyone doubled over with laughter. He spun yarns about jackrabbits riding coyotes, about a horse that talked back in perfect English, about a cowboy who lassoed the moon and demanded it light his camp. Nonsense, of course, but delightful nonsense. And in the middle of nowhere, delightful nonsense is worth more than gold. As you sit by the fire, humming along with the others, you understand the deeper truth. Songs and stories bound cowboys together. Without them, you'd just be a scatter of lonely men chasing cattle under the stars. With them, you become a crew, a family of sorts, stitched together by shared laughter, rhythm, and imagination. The myth of the lone cowboy may shine in novels, but reality is here, in the circle of firelight, where voices rise against the dark, and so the night stretches on. Cattle settle, horses snort softly, heads bowed. The fire dwindles, but your voice carries, reminding you that even in the vast silence of the prairie, you are not alone. Your song echoes through time, a thread connecting past cowboys to present dreamers, weaving memory and myth into something enduring. Tomorrow will bring dust, sweat, and endless work. But tonight you have music, you have laughter, you have stories, and that's enough to keep your spirit alive on the trail. Your stomach growls, and you realize that cowboy life isn't just about saddles, ropes, and long rides. It's also about food, or at least the kind of food that keeps you alive when you're hundreds of miles from the nearest town. Out here, no fancy meals await you at the end of the day. There's no cafe, no delivery app, no steaming bowl of pho arriving at your campfire. Instead, you make do with what you can carry, what you can hunt, and what the chuck wagon rattles along behind you. If cowboy songs keep the soul alive, frontier food keeps the body staggering forward. Let's start with the basics. Beans. Cowboys ate beans the way modern folks eat snacks. Constantly, endlessly, in every possible variation. Pinto beans, black beans, navy beans. If it could be boiled in a pot over fire, it was supper. Add a pinch of salt pork if the cook was generous, or a splash of molasses if supplies held out. Otherwise, you learned to enjoy beans plain, every single day until you dreamed about them. Jokes flew fast around campfires. One cowboy swore he could name each bean in the pot individually. Another claimed he could track time by the rhythm of digestive noises echoing through the night. Not glamorous, but it filled you. Then came hardtack. Imagine a cracker, but one baked without mercy. Flour, water, maybe a pinch of salt. That's it. Hardened into bricks so tough you could break a tooth on them. Hardtack travelled well and spoiled slowly. Cowboys dunked it in coffee just to soften it enough to chew. Sometimes, if you were unlucky, you found little weevils inside, wriggling like extra protein. Some riders shrugged, ate the bugs, and called it flavour. Historians still argue whether hardtack saved more cowboys than it sickened. But one thing's clear. Without it, many drives would have starved long before reaching the railheads. Coffee deserves its own chapter. Strong, black, and often boiled until it resembled tar, coffee was the fuel of the cowboy world. You wake up before dawn, shivering in the cold, and the smell of coffee rising from the pot is salvation. It's so bitter it curls your tongue, but you drink anyway, hands wrapped tight around a tin cup. Quirky fact: some cowboys swore coffee could fix anything. Hangovers, snakebite, heartbreak, even saddle sores. Others joked it was strong enough to float a horseshoe. Either way, the pot never seemed empty, because the cook knew life without coffee was unthinkable. Meat appeared when luck struck. Salted pork was common, packed in barrels that rolled along in the chuck wagon. Sometimes you got beef jerky, dried strips tough as rope but tasty when chewed long enough. On better days, cowboys hunted. Rabbits, prairie chickens, or even deer might wind up sizzling over campfire flames. But game was never guaranteed, and ammunition wasn't cheap, so you didn't waste bullets unless you were confident. Fresh meat felt like a holiday, a break from the monotony of beans and biscuits. And oh, those biscuits. The camp cook, known as the Cookie, was king of the trail. He ruled from his chuck wagon like a monarch, doling out biscuits, stews, and the occasional pie if supplies allowed. Cowboys knew better than to anger the Cookie. Insult his cooking, and you might find your plate a little lighter the next night. Praise him, and maybe he'd sneak you an extra biscuit slathered in precious bacon grease. Historians still argue whether cowboys respected their trail bosses or their cooks more, but one thing's certain: cross the cook at your own risk. Every once in a while, food turned creative. Cowboys flavoured beans with wild onions or threw in prickly pear pads after burning off the spines. Coffee got a dash of cinnamon if someone had smuggled spices from town. One quirky tale tells of a trail crew that accidentally cooked beans in a pot used for horseshoes. The men swore it was the best iron-rich stew they'd ever tasted. Necessity breeds invention, and cowboys were nothing if not inventive when hunger gnawed too sharp. Meals also carried a social weight. After hours of silence on the trail, food brought men together. Cowboys sat in a circle, tin plates balanced on their knees, swapping jokes and trading stories while the cook ladled out beans. Food wasn't just fuel, it was glue, binding the crew into something more than strangers riding side by side. You remember laughter echoing across the prairie as one cowboy tried to play his harmonica, with his mouth still full of biscuit crumbs. But let's not romanticize too much. The truth is, cowboy food could be rough. Beans scorched at the bottom of the pot, biscuits burned to black lumps, meat salted until your lips cracked. You swallowed it all anyway, because hunger didn't care about flavour. Cowboys joked that if you didn't like the cooking, you could volunteer to replace the cook, though no one ever did. Complaining only earned you a sharp look and another helping of beans. And yet, food on the frontier built more than muscle. It built memory. Years later, old cowboys would recall the taste of smoky bacon at dawn, the smell of biscuits baking in Dutch ovens, the way coffee perked spirits on frozen mornings. These meals, humble and harsh, stitched themselves into the fabric of cowboy identity. They weren't feasts, but they were survival, and survival has its own flavour. So you scrape the last beans from your plate, lean back against your saddle and sigh. Tomorrow you'll eat the same thing again, and the day after, and the day after that. But tonight, under the wide sky, with the firelight flickering and laughter in your ears, even beans taste like luxury. Food may not define the cowboy myth, but it sure keeps the myth alive. The trail is long, the work is grueling, and the days blur together in dust and sweat. But somewhere in the middle of all that labour, a spark of competition lights up. Cowboys, restless and eager to prove themselves, start turning their everyday chores into contests. Who can rope a steer fastest? Who can stay on a bucking bronco longest? Who can flip a calf and tie it before the dust even settles? These rough games, born out of boredom and pride, slowly grow into something bigger, something that would one day be called rodeo. Picture it. You've been driving cattle for weeks, and finally the herd reaches a rail town. The work is done, the animals are sold, and your pockets jingle with wages that already feel too light. What do you do with that energy, that pent-up grit? You gather in the open yard with other cowboys, and someone calls out a challenge. Maybe it's a lasso contest, loop that steer faster than the next man. Maybe it's bareback riding, climb on the wildest horse and hold on until your bones rattle. The crowd of onlookers grows, townsfolk cheering, gamblers shouting odds, and suddenly, routine ranch work becomes a spectacle. At its core, rodeo is cowboy life exaggerated, sharpened into theatre. Roping wasn't invented for crowds. It was a skill to catch calves for branding or treat an injured steer. But when turned into a contest, it became something dazzling, a blur of rope and dust, a test of precision under pressure. The same went for bronc riding. Cowboys had to break horses for ranch use, teaching them to accept saddle and rider. But who could resist showing off by staying on the wildest beast the longest? What was once necessity became bragging rights, and bragging rights became the foundation of sport. Historians still argue about when the first true rodeo happened. Some say it was in the mid-1800s in the Southwest, where vaqueros and Anglo-cowboys competed during fiestas. Others point to Pecos, Texas in 1883, often claimed as the birthplace of the organized rodeo. But the roots stretch back further into the Spanish traditions of charreada, where horsemen competed in ranch skills long before the term rodeo spread north. The cowboy world has many fathers, and like all good traditions, it grew out of shared work turned into shared pride. Quirky fact: early rodeos weren't neat stadium events. They were chaotic, dusty affairs, often staged in makeshift arenas with wooden fences barely holding in the animals. Riders risked life and limb not just for glory, but often for wages or bottles of whiskey. One tale tells of a cowboy who stayed on a bucking horse so long, the animal collapsed before he did, though whether the horse or cowboy was more stubborn is still up for debate. These early contests blended danger, comedy, and showmanship, setting the tone for what rodeo would eventually become. And while men dominated the early scenes, women found their way into the ring too. By the late 19th century, female sharpshooters and trick riders wowed crowds. Think of Annie Oakley, with her rifle splitting playing cards mid-air, or later cowgirls who could stand on galloping horses, skirts flying, daring the audience not to gasp. Rodeo, like the West itself, was never as neatly divided by gender as myth-makers like to claim. Where there was courage and flair, there was a place in the dust. Food and song kept cowboys sane, but rodeo gave them something else: recognition. For once, their brutal skills weren't invisible labour behind the scenes of ranch life. They were front and centre, celebrated, applauded, even paid for. Imagine the pride of a cowboy who spent weeks shoving stubborn cattle through rivers and storms, now stepping into an arena and hearing the roar of a crowd as he throws his rope with flawless accuracy. For a moment, sweat and struggle transform into artistry, but rodeo wasn't just entertainment, it was identity. It crystallized what the cowboy represented: toughness, skill, and a streak of reckless daring. Towns competed to host the best shows, and soon rodeo posters spread like wildfire, drawing crowds with promises of wild broncs, fierce bulls, and fearless riders. The cowboy, once just another labourer on the dusty plains, became a performer, a folk hero, an icon of grit. The myth sharpened, polished, and spread across the nation, all thanks to contests born around a campfire. Still, reality lurked under the glitz. Rodeo was dangerous, unforgiving, and sometimes deadly. Broken bones, concussions, trampling hooves, these weren't rare mishaps but expected risks. Cowboys joked about walking away with fewer teeth than they'd started with, but the danger was real. Rodeo demanded the same stubborn resilience as ranch life, magnified under the eyes of a roaring crowd. Yet that danger was part of the draw. Audiences craved the raw edge, the feeling that anything might happen in the dust-filled ring. By the turn of the 20th century, rodeo had begun transforming into organised sport, with rules, prizes, and professional riders. But even as it evolved, it clung tightly to its roots. Every rope thrown, every bucking ride, every dusty crash into the dirt traced back to daily ranch work, to the cowboy proving himself in ways only another cowboy could truly respect. The myth was growing, yes, but it was still tethered to the sweat and grit of real labour. So you wipe dust from your brow, watching a rider cling desperately to a bronco, his hat flying, the crowd roaring like thunder. You know this isn't just spectacle, it's heritage, born from necessity, turned into art. It's the cowboy spirit distilled into contests that echo across generations. Rodeo is proof that even the hardest labour can carry beauty when lit by pride and performance. And as you feel the crowd's roar vibrate in your chest, you realise the cowboy doesn't just survive the frontier, he turns survival into spectacle, grit into legend. The cowboy might seem like a purely American figure, striding out of the dust with hat pulled low and spurs jingling. But if you peel back the layers of myth, you'll find the cowboy is really a patchwork of cultures stitched together on the frontier. His saddle, his lasso, even his word rodeo came not from the prairies of Texas but from Mexico, where vaqueros had been wrangling cattle since the Spanish first brought livestock across the Atlantic. Without the vaquero, there is no cowboy. Just a man on a horse, missing half the tools and traditions that make him legendary. Imagine the first time Anglo settlers watched vaqueros at work. They saw whips coiled at the saddle horn, lassos spinning with effortless precision, boots flared wide to protect against brush. They borrowed the gear, the slang, even the swagger, turning caballo into cowboy, rodeo into a word that once meant a simple cattle roundup. The West was never a one-man story. It was a tapestry of skills carried north, reshaped and blended until no one remembered exactly where one culture ended and another began. But vaqueros weren't the only ones shaping this world. Native American tribes whose lands the cowboys rode across left their mark in ways both practical and tragic. Some native peoples joined cattle crews, trading their knowledge of the land for wages and survival. They taught white and Mexican riders how to read rivers, how to follow subtle signs of weather, how to move across plains with efficiency that no textbook could capture. At the same time, others resisted fiercely, driven from ancestral grounds by the very expansion that gave cowboys their open ranges. It was a collision, sometimes blending, sometimes clashing, the frontier full of both learning and loss. You picture yourself riding alongside a mixed crew, a Mexican vaquero whose saddle is worn smooth with years of use, a Comanche guide pointing out the safest crossing on a swollen river, and a European immigrant fumbling with his rope, eager but clumsy. This is the true face of the West, not the lone cowboy, but a rough fellowship of men from different worlds, thrown together by cattle and survival. At night, their campfire sparks carried not just smoke but stories in many languages, blending into a new kind of folklore. And let's not forget the African American cowboys, who history tried too often to erase. After the Civil War, thousands of freedmen headed west, finding work and a measure of freedom on ranches. They made up as many as 1 in 4 working cowboys, yet popular tales rarely showed their faces. They rode the same trails, ate the same dust, risked the same dangers. Nat Love, known as Deadwood Dick, became one of the most famous winning roping contests and living the kind of larger-than-life adventures pulp writers could barely keep up with. Every time you picture a cowboy under the burning sun, remember, his skin could be any shade. Cultures didn't just collide in work, they collided in play. Think back to those early rodeos, where vaquero rope tricks dazzled crowds, where Anglo riders tried to prove they could match their Mexican peers, and where native riders brought speed and daring to horse races that sent audiences gasping. Each performance was both competition and cross-pollination, traditions borrowed and bent until they felt like something entirely new. Rodeo didn't just celebrate cowboy skills, it showcased the cultural melting pot that gave the cowboy his identity. Yet not all collisions were harmonious. Conflicts between ranchers and native tribes tore open wounds that would never fully heal. Settlers drove herds across sacred hunting grounds, trampled buffalo herds into near extinction, and sparked wars that scarred generations. Cowboys often found themselves on the edges of these clashes, sometimes allies to the army, sometimes reluctant participants, sometimes caught in the middle. Survival meant learning from cultures even as the larger tide of expansion worked to erase them. It's a contradiction at the heart of cowboy life, borrowing knowledge while erasing its source. Still, the frontier had a way of leveling pride. A cowboy facing a flooded river didn't care if the advice came from a vaquero or a Lakota scout, as long as it kept him alive. Hunger stripped away arrogance. Cold nights made fellowship precious. And so, in the hard school of necessity, cultures rubbed together, clashing, blending, shaping a figure who carried pieces of all of them. Think about the cowboy gear we still picture today. the wide-brimmed sombrero that shrank into the cowboy hat, the high-heeled boots, perfect for stirrups, borrowed straight from Spanish design, the lariat, crafted with techniques honed in Mexico long before Texas ever saw cattle. Even the cattle themselves, the longhorns that defined Texas ranching, were descendants of Spanish herds. Strip away these layers and the cowboy myth would collapse. His roots are as international as they are American. And so, when you picture yourself under the endless western sky, remember you're not alone. You're riding with echoes. The vaquero whose rope first whistled through the air, the native scout who traced a safe trail through canyon and desert, the black cowboy who turned hardship into mastery, the immigrant who dreamed of belonging in a strange land. Together they created the cowboy not as a man, but as an idea, a symbol of freedom, grit, and resilience, forged at the crossroads of cultures. That idea still carries power. It's why the cowboy myth lingers, why rodeo arenas still echo with Spanish terms, why cowboy songs hum with rhythms borrowed from many tongues. The cowboy is more than a single story. He's a chorus, a blending, a collision. And as you ride into the dusk, dust rising like incense around your horse's hooves, you feel that weight and wonder. You are one rider, but you carry countless voices. The West was never just yours, it was everyone's. After endless weeks of hard riding, with dust in your teeth and calluses so deep you swear they're permanent, you finally see it. The end of the trail. A railhead town, loud and alive, sitting like an oasis after the desert of the plains. You've driven thousands of longhorns across rivers and through storms, past rattlesnakes and under skies that threaten to crush you. Now all that labour has funneled into this single moment. Corrals, rail cars, and men with ledgers waiting to decide what your blood and sweat are worth. At first, it doesn't feel real. The town rises from the prairie like a mirage. False front buildings painted in bright colours, church bells ringing above the din, saloon music tumbling into the streets. Compared to the silence of the plains, it's chaos. Delicious chaos. You and your crew stink of sweat and cattle, clothes stiff with grime, but nobody cares. Townsfolk crane their necks to see the herd thunder past. Merchants smile wide, dreaming of beef and booming trade. The railroad men shout, their voices swallowed by the hissing steam of the engine. Civilization has arrived, but it smells just as much of manure as it does of progress. The work isn't over, though. You guide the herd into holding pens, the cattle crashing against wooden rails, horns clattering like swords. Buyers circle, wearing pressed suits and pocket watches, pointing with canes as though they've ever ridden a mile in the saddle. They haggle over prices, talking in numbers that feel more like a foreign language. You watch, tired and sore, knowing the success of the entire drive rests not on your skill, but on these men's calculations. It's a bitter pill. Cowboys bleed to deliver the herd, but the profit goes to ranch owners and businessmen. Historians still argue whether the cowboy was truly free or just another cog in the great machine of commerce. Judging by the soot-covered men scribbling in ledgers, you lean toward the second, and yet a different reward waits. Town life. After months of beans and bacon, you catch the smell of fresh bread, tobacco smoke, and whiskey. Your stomach growls so loud the others laugh. Then the saloon looms, swinging doors wide, piano clanging off-key, the hum of voices promising all the things you've missed. Comfort, noise, and maybe a little danger. Inside, the floor vibrates with boot stomps, glasses slam against wood, and laughter rolls like thunder. You throw back a shot, feel it burn like liquid fire, and for the first time in weeks you almost feel human again. Cowboys, of course, burn through money like kindling. One night in town could undo months of wages. Gambling tables whisper with temptation, cards flashing like blades in lamplight. A few drinks and you swear your luck is unstoppable, until suddenly your pay vanishes into the dealer's stack. Outside, ladies lean against balcony rails, calling down offers that make you blush despite the dust in your pores. You know you can't afford much, but after weeks of cattle and campfire jokes, the sight of a smile is enough to make your knees weak. Town is a fever dream, and like all dreams, it costs dearly, and danger waits. A spilled drink can spark a fistfight. A cheating hand can end in drawn pistols. Sheriffs, or men pretending to be, stride in, trying to keep order, though their methods often look as reckless as the chaos they're stopping. You learn to keep your back to a wall, hat brim low, one hand near your belt. Out on the trail your enemies were storms and snakes. In town your enemies wear spurs too, and sometimes they smile before striking. Morning comes, and with it, regret. Your head pounds, your pockets feel too light, and you wonder how many more drives you'll need to pay off this one night. Some cowboys sign up for another trail immediately, chasing wages like gamblers chase luck. Others fade into town life, working in stockyards or sweeping saloon floors. A lucky few, those who manage to hold on to their pay, buy land and settle, trading saddle leather for plows. But most of you drift on, because drifting is what cowboys do. The trail is both a job and a spell. You can't seem to quit it. There's a debate even among the crew. Is the end of the trail freedom, or just the start of another chain? For some, it's triumph. You made it, survived, got paid. For others, it's proof you're trapped in a cycle that never ends. Ride, deliver, spend, repeat. Historians still argue which is true, but in your bones you know it's both. You're freer than factory men in smoky cities, yet chained to cattle in a way you can't escape. Still, pride lingers. Pride in the herd you brought across rivers, in the songs you sang beneath cold stars, in the dust storms you endured without quitting. Even if the town swallows your wages, it can't swallow the stories. You'll tell of the night the piano man quit mid-song to listen to your trail ballad, or the time you toppled head first into a horse trough to impress a girl. Those stories stick longer than dollars ever do. As the train whistles and cattle load into boxcars, you stand at the edge of town, hat tugged low against the rising sun. The herd is gone, the pay is gone, but the horizon waits. Somewhere out there, another ranch needs riders, another herd needs moving. The trail never truly ends. It just bends into another beginning. You shoulder your saddle, spit dust from your teeth, and walk on, boots clicking against planks that already feel too solid. The west is calling again, and you know you'll answer. By now, your boots are worn thin, and your saddle creaks like an old friend. Yet the strangest thing about being a cowboy is realizing that the real trail doesn't end with you. It keeps riding forward in stories, songs, and the imaginations of people who will never smell a steer or feel dust in their lungs. The cowboy lives on, not just as flesh and bone, but as a legend stitched together from scraps of truth and yards of exaggeration. Even while you're alive, the myth is already being written. Dime novels fly off shelves back east, painting cowboys as gunslinging loners who never miss a shot and never spill a drink. You chuckle at the thought. If only those writers could have seen you spill coffee down your shirt while trying to mount your horse at dawn. Still, the stories sell, and in a way, they sell you. Cowboys become larger than life, and suddenly a hard, dusty job transforms into the symbol of freedom itself. Historians still argue whether those myths helped preserve cowboy culture or buried its reality. But you can't deny they gave the cowboy immortality. Hollywood joins in later, amplifying the image until it drowns out the truth. Black and white films roll across screens, showing rugged men with spotless hats, perfect aim, and just enough stubble to look dashing. The cowboy's dirt and exhaustion are erased, replaced with a romantic hero who never smells like cattle dung. When you watch, you shake your head. Real cowboys carried blisters, fleas, and a constant craving for beans. But audiences didn't want beans. They wanted adventure, a story where good wore white and evil wore black. The myth was cleaner, sharper, and infinitely easier to sell. But the cowboy isn't only America's dream, it's a global one. In Europe, cowboy novels became so popular that German author Karl May, who never set foot in the West, sold millions of copies about it. His cowboys and Native Americans captured imaginations across oceans. In Japan, westerns influenced manga and films, with lone wanderers taking cues from the cowboy's silhouette. The myth galloped farther than any trailherd ever did, spreading freedom and grit as if they were commodities shipped by rail. Of course, myths leave shadows. Remember those African-American cowboys, those native guides, those Mexican vaqueros who shape the very tools you use? Their faces rarely appear in the stories. Popular culture preferred a narrow hero, tall, white, and usually speaking with a Texas drawl. Historians debate whether the myth served to unite people with a shared symbol or erase the diverse reality behind it. As you sit by the fire, you know the truth. The cowboy was never just one man, never just one face. He was many, and their stories deserve equal dust on the trail. Music carries the legend forward too. From trail songs hummed under the stars to country ballads blasting on radios, the cowboy's loneliness and toughness seep into lyrics. You might not realize it, but when a country singer croons about heartbreak with a guitar, echoes of the campfire still whisper behind the chords. Even rock stars and pop singers occasionally don cowboy hats, chasing that same myth of rugged authenticity. Somehow the cowboy still holds cultural weight, even in skyscraper cities where the only cattle are on restaurant menus. And then there's fashion. Your boots and hat, once tools of necessity, now strut down city streets and fashion runways. People who've never saddled a horse pay top dollar for leather boots, rhinestone shirts, and belt buckles the size of frying pans. You laugh softly. If they only knew how many hours you spent rubbing blisters under those same boots, or how much trail dust settled in your hatband. But that's the funny thing about legacy. It doesn't have to be accurate to endure. The myth also shapes politics and identity. Leaders invoke the cowboy to project toughness, independence, and a willingness to ride alone. The cowboy becomes shorthand for bravery, even stubbornness, sometimes used to justify wars or policies that have nothing to do with cattle. The image carries power because it taps into something universal, the desire to be free, untethered, strong enough to face the horizon alone. Still, you can't help but wonder what future generations will see when they look back. Will they see the real cowboy, the tired, sore, half-broke labourer who worked from dawn to dusk? Or will they only see the mythic hero who never sweats, never doubts, never falters? Historians still argue how much truth is left under the dust of the myth, but maybe both are needed. The truth grounds us. The myth inspires us. Without the myth, the cowboy might fade into obscurity. Without the truth, we forget the people who lived, bled, and sang under the endless sky. As you ride into the fading light of this section, you realize that your saddle carries not only your weight, but the weight of every story told after you. The cowboy you are will die, but the cowboy people dream about, he'll ride forever through dime novels, films, songs, and whispered bedtime tales. Maybe that's the greatest legacy of all, to live on, dusty and imperfect, somewhere between fact and fiction, forever riding into the horizon. When you wake from the dust of memory and blink into the modern world, the first surprise is this: cowboys still exist. Not as dime novel gunslingers or Hollywood heroes with spotless boots, but as working men and women who rise before dawn, swing into saddles, and drive cattle across land that hasn't changed as much as you might think. The West may have telephone poles and highways now, but step beyond the pavement and you'll still hear the bawl of calves, the creak of leather, and the steady rhythm of hooves pressing into dirt. Today's cowboys carry smartphones as often as six-shooters, but their lives remain defined by the land. They mend fences, brand cattle, rope strays, and ride through weather that ignores whether it's the 21st century or the 19th. In Texas, Wyoming, Montana, and even places far beyond, Brazil, Australia, Spain, ranch workers still live by the code of dust, grit, and long hours. You might laugh at a cowboy scrolling Instagram on horseback, but even that feels like part of the same myth, blending past and present in one strange ride. And it's not just men anymore. Women who once stood in the shadows of campfires now ride tall in rodeo arenas, work ranches and manage herds with the same stubborn pride as any vaquero. The myth left them out for too long, but the reality is finally catching up. Watch a barrel racer whip around barrels faster than most men can blink, or see a ranch matriarch oversee cattle sales with an iron will, and you realize the cowboy legacy belongs to everyone. The cowboy's presence lingers even in city hearts. Look around. Cowboy boots clack on urban sidewalks, country music fills stadiums, and rodeo arenas swell with cheering crowds. The rodeo itself has grown into a global sport, with bull riding considered one of the most dangerous competitions in the world. Riders climb onto snorting animals bred to buck with ferocity, and for 8 seconds they fight gravity and fear. The crowd roars, hats fly, and you can almost feel the ghost of the old trail riders grinning at this blend of sport and spectacle. Yet modern cowboys wrestle with challenges their ancestors never imagined. Droughts worsen with climate shifts, ranching profits tighten, and technology creeps in with drones monitoring herds from above. Historians still argue whether ranching as a lifestyle is fading into nostalgia or simply adapting to survive. Some say the cowboy is becoming more symbol than profession, a role kept alive by rodeo and Hollywood. Others argue the cowboy's work will endure as long as cattle graze grass and horses need riders. The debate itself proves how deeply the cowboy myth is stitched into the fabric of culture. Cultural legacy stretches farther than the range. Politicians pose in Stetsons to project grit. Fashion designers reinvent denim jackets and wide-brimmed hats every season. Even video games and television dramas cast the cowboy as the ultimate avatar of rugged independence. You may not own a horse, but you can live the cowboy myth by cranking country music in your car, watching a western at midnight, or pulling on boots for a night out. The cowboy today is as much about identity as occupation. Still, the truest cowboys remain where they've always been. In the saddle at dawn, dogs nipping at hooves, breath steaming in cold air. They don't care much for myths. Their worries are more immediate. A broken fence line, a sick calf, a storm rolling across the horizon. If you ride alongside them, you'll realize that while the tools have changed, ATVs instead of pack horses, GPS instead of trail markers, the core hasn't. It's still about endurance, resilience, and a deep relationship with land that rewards and punishes in equal measure. And here's the quiet truth. Cowboys today may not sing trail songs as much, but when the sun sets and the work is done, you can still hear echoes of the old voices. In the hush of evening, as stars prick the sky and cattle settle into stillness, the line between past and present blurs. You're no longer sure if the rider across the pasture is a ranch hand with a smartphone or a shadow of a vaquero from centuries ago. The rhythm of hooves is timeless, and so is the figure in the saddle. The cowboy survives because the world needs him, but also because we want him to survive. We crave his stubborn independence, his rough humour, his dance with danger and dust. The cowboy today is a worker, a performer, a symbol, and a myth all at once. He's in the rodeo ring, in the pasture, in a song on the radio, in the imagination of a child wearing a plastic hat. He's in you too, every time you long for freedom and an open horizon. So the trail never truly ends. The cattle drive becomes a rodeo. The campfire song becomes a Spotify playlist. The saddle becomes a leather chair in some office that still calls itself a ranch. But the essence, that mix of grit, courage and humour, remains. The cowboy of yesterday breathes through the cowboy of today, both real and myth, always riding, never finished. And now, as the dust of the trail finally settles, you ease back into the quiet. The clamour of hooves fades, the saloon laughter drifts away, and all that remains is the steady rhythm of your own breath. The cowboy's story stretches far behind you, across open plains and glowing campfires. But tonight, you don't need to ride anymore. You just need to rest. Close your eyes and picture the wide horizon, not as a challenge, but as a calm, endless sea of grass. The sun dips low, painting the sky in soft ribbons of pink and gold. The air is cool, sweet with sage, and the ground beneath you feels steady after so many miles. You hear the faint jingle of a spur, the quiet snort of a horse settling for the night, and then even those sounds soften, folding into silence. The cowboy's life may be full of grit and struggle, but here in this stillness there is only peace. You don't need to rope or ride or fight storms. You've already done enough. You've walked the trail, carried the myth, and now you can let it go just for a while. Let the stories fade into the stars above. Let the myths ride on without you, for now the only journey is inward, toward calm, toward rest. Your breath slows, your body softens, and you sink deeper into the comfort of knowing that tomorrow can wait. Tonight, the trail ends right here, with you safe, quiet, and at ease. Sweet dreams, cowboy.